By 1960, President Eisenhower had served now two presidential terms. And even though many things had taken place in regards to consumerism, our interstate highways, things along those lines, a number of people were dissatisfied with the movement of our civil rights and other things that affected society. And the 1960 election would be one of the most contentious in American history. Not because the two major candidates didn't like each other, they certainly revered each other and had respect for one another, but people were oftentimes, even though reasonably close in political views, they were still shifted in the various forward movements. In 1960, the Democrats would eventually nominate John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK for short, for their presidential candidate. And the Republican Party would nominate former Vice President under President Eisenhower, Richard Nixon. So, Richard Nixon ran on a campaign that was reasonably similar in prosperous movements to what you had in the Eisenhower campaign. He wanted modest government adjustments to moderately address some of the social concerns. But for a number of people, it wasn't quite enough. JFK ran on a campaign that we needed to prosper economically, but we needed also a dramatic shift in the way some civil rights were delivered, if you will. The question of how do we finally treat black people rears its head. The 1960 election was very popular in American history. And the reason why I say that is because it's really the first election in American history where modern media and media platforms are really able to take hold. One of the reasons why JFK was successful in his candidacy is that he was able to utilize TV talk shows, um, other types of interview where he had access to media. He had a young family life. Jackie Bouvier was his wife. She was a young socialite, attractive woman. Uh, they had a child and another one on the way. They were the Kennedys. The Kennedys, JFK's dad and his brothers, they came from a long line of established politics. So they're a great name in American political history, the Kennedys. And the portrayal of a family life and JFK being this larger than life popular figure, a man of moral character, if you will, family man, great family name, good, wholesome American East Coast name, that comes into play. And he wins over the hearts of many Americans because a lot of people can really identify with the family value mindset, and he's able to harp on that. JFK is also Catholic, and in 1960, he had only been the second presidential candidate to be Catholic, to even have a chance. And for many Americans, that's a no go, and for other Americans, that is a must have. My grandfather, for example, my dad's dad, Grandpa Joe, in 1960, he voted for JFK solely on the fact that he was Catholic. My grandfather, my personal family, we come from a very, very long line of Catholics. I'm Catholic. My parents are Catholic. My grandparents are all Catholic. Their parents were Catholic. My children are Catholic. So on and so on. My grandfather voted for JFK solely because he was Catholic, even though he actually found himself agreeing maybe slightly more with Richard Nixon. Okay, there you go. For other Americans, being Catholic is a gigantic turnoff. You have a lot of Protestants who are against Catholics. You have a whole Christian divide between Catholics and Protestants. And for some people, they absolutely could not have a former Irish immigrant family Catholic. No, we can't have Catholics. No, 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 no. They don't say the Our Father in its entirety. They pay too much attention to the Holy Trinity. They revere Mary too much. A lot of your common Protestant complaints about Catholics are talked about. I mean, if this person's going to lead our country and he happens to have a very traditional Christian view, as opposed to a Protestant Christian view, which has its own traditions, which are certainly worth merit, but different. So a lot of people feared having a Catholic as president. Okay. That being said, Richard Nixon and JFK would often engage in popular debates, often televised on TV. One debate in particular in the fall of 1960 occurred, and remember, TVs were still largely in black and white at this time. One televised debate occurred between the two candidates, very civilized, very well respectful of one another, solid debate. These are two pros working at each other, and they're very civil, which is great to see, unlike some possible current day recourse, but that's a whole different story. Um, JFK utilized the talents of perhaps maybe a makeup artist to kind of pat himself down in the face and just kind of make himself look a little bit more together and refined. Where Richard Nixon eventually would somehow look, even though he was perfectly fine, it looked as though he was a little bit more stressed, maybe perhaps a little sweat bead here and there or anything else of the sort. That particular debate, you ask most people who won, and you get straight 50-50 reviews. JFK was better. No, Nixon was better. Um, a number of people thought JFK won simply because he looked the part maybe a little bit better. That has a lot to do, aesthetics have a lot to do with how you might be perceived. Again, this is a guy who has a family, a young, attractive wife, a kid, another one on the way. Um, he's your quintessential view of an American family. Okay, now you look the part, you look a little bit more presentable in the public view, and all of a sudden that's going to have an effect on how you might be perceived. That particular debate was enough to give JFK just enough momentum in that 1960 fall election for president. He very narrowly defeated Richard Nixon in a very close election. The popular vote numbers were somewhere along the lines of 34,200,000 for JFK and 34,100,000 for Nixon. That is incredibly close for a national election. Now, of course, as we know, the popular vote does not win the election. It is the Electoral College and how many votes in the Electoral College you get based upon state populations and whatnot. So for those of you who've taken Government 2205, you ought to know about the Electoral College and the reasons why we still have it. That being said, even though it was a very close election, JFK had a significantly larger amount. You need 271 electoral votes to win. JFK came away with 303. So John Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, if you will, would become our president. And in early 1961, he was inaugurated. And immediately he upon a course of action. His whole campaign had largely been run on the idea of creating a new frontier, in a sense that he wanted to address civil rights. He wanted to do something about society's ills and overall society's welfare, while also addressing our economic issues and perhaps maybe reducing and cutting taxes to help people with their pocketbooks. If you look at JFK's early presidential images, he talks about addressing economic concerns about how cutting taxes might actually increase tax revenue. That's not something that you hear from modern day Democrats very much. So for him to have gone that way to address economic concerns from that sort of standpoint, that's pretty cutting edge at the time. So he ran on the New Frontier. We're going to talk about some more details about JFK's presidency in future slides. JFK, in November of 1963, in an effort to regalvanize the Southern Democratic force, if you will, so that he could run for re-election in 1964, was making the rounds throughout southern states, and eventually he'd make his way to Texas so as to galvanize Southern Democrats for his cause. And in November 1963, he had various engagements right here in Dallas, Texas. And on a parade route from a book depository building in Dealey Plaza, along the route, JFK was shot at, hitting him once in the throat and once that ricocheted and hit his head by a young man named Lee Harvey Oswald, who had actually served in the Marine Corps, believe it or not. But he was thought to maybe be perhaps a communist sympathizer because he had actually spent time in the Soviet Union and in Cuba. And he was thought maybe to have been in cahoots with them in some sort of conspiracy theorist fashion. He was disenfranchised with various different things going on in the United States. And Dealey Plaza, he shoots and eventually kills JFK. JFK was immediately taken to Parkland Hospital here in Dallas, and he was pronounced dead shortly thereafterward. Also wounded in the conflict was Texas Governor Connally. He survived, okay, but nonetheless harrowing for Governor Connally. Otherwise, though, you've got some other things that are going to start unraveling because of JFK's immediate assassination. The day after, shortly after JFK was shot, it was uncovered with the whole Lee Harvey Oswald situation. He was arrested and put into custody. And as he was being transferred from one location to another, I believe it may have been even Lutz Sterrett. I'm not 100% sure on that. As he was being transferred, he was actually approached by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. And on live television, Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And Lee Harvey Oswald died soon thereafter. A number of conspiracy theories revolve around JFK's assassination, the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby's role, all kinds of different things. There was a commission put into play, the Warren Commission, who would investigate JFK's assassination, rationale and reasoning why, and other theories that may lead to why this may have happened, how it could happen, how it can be prevented in future Secret Service type protections, and what we can do to prevent a president from being assassinated, and just why JFK may have been assassinated. Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone? Was Jack Ruby somehow in cahoots? We don't know. The Warren Commission came out and basically said that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. This was an act of one person. One person did it. One person shot the rounds. One person did it as a motivation and set everything up. He acted alone. Jack Ruby acted alone in murdering Lee Harvey Oswald on his prison exchange, and that there was no conspiracy. That is what the official Warren Commission's report said. Quite a number of conspiracies have come out in the decades since. I personally believe, just me personally, I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did act alone. I believe that. Quite a number of people disagree with me vehemently. How could there be a second shot, a different angle, and you got to look at the footage this way, you got to look at that, and there are other people, the Russians tried to do this and that, and There are so many different conspiracies out there. Um, I sometimes I don't know what to believe, and people seem kind of kooky with some of their reasoning and rationale behind their conspiracies. Otherwise, though, all I know is that there is a massive controversy that exists to this day about JFK's assassination. Um, what bothers me just as much about the actual assassination itself is that it occurred here in Dallas. That's not that far from Richland College. I mean, that's a 15-minute drive to downtown. That was here in Dallas. And that put a stain on the city because that's where a president was assassinated. And then his assassin was murdered on live television in Dallas as well. So, oftentimes the country associated the city of Dallas, Texas with presidential murder and assassinations. And it wasn't really until the 1970s when the Dallas Cowboys really became a popular American figure, America's team, if you will. And then, of course, you had a soap opera by the show Dallas that portrayed Dallas a certain way. That Dallas began to somewhat recover from a PR standpoint. Otherwise, though, in 1963 and the years that came afterward, Dallas didn't always have a great name. That's because we murdered a president, or so people say. Otherwise, though, JFK won that election in 1960, began reforms, which we'll detail shortly in a little bit in a few different slides and chapters, and he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Now we begin a new era.